Nice to have you here. I'm Shah Osha, faculty of Visual Art and Critical Visual Studies, and I'm teaching a program this quarter, second quarter, called Art, Time, and Animation and Painting. And I organized this art lecture series for those of you who haven't been here before to present a broad range of interdisciplinary approaches to contemporary art issues by a number of different disciplines: artists, writers, activists, scholars, and that fluid overlap. But it's an opportunity for us to gather as a sort of shared curriculum to engage with their work and their thinking in a variety of modes and forms that respond to our rapidly unfolding contemporary moment. So for us to think about sort of what's larger issues that people are putting their attention towards. All of our lectures will be on Zoom this quarter, they'll on Wednesdays every other week from 11:30 to 1. They're free and open to the public, and they're recorded, so you can find almost all of them on our WordPress site, which is sites.evergreen.edu/art-lecture-series, all one word, /. And I just want to thank Professor Kathleen Amon for the work she's done with me these last 2 quarters to help run this, and Raoul Berman and Dave Crampton and media interns for the help and support and tech that they've given us for many years on to coordinate it over Zoom now and then recording them. So the schedule this spring, today we have Tom Comitta with us, who is a writer and also interdisciplinary in his practice, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. In week 4, on the 26th of this month, we have Mark Alice Durant, who is an artist, writer, and publisher living in Baltimore. He's the author of Maya Deren, Choreographed for Camera, 27 Contexts and Anecdotal History of Photography, Robert Heineken, A Material History, and co-author of Blur of the Otherworldly, Contemporary Art, Technology, and the Paranormal. So those are sort of the things that he's got choreography, photography, and contemporary art, technology, and paranormal are his interests. He teaches in Visual Arts Department at the University of Maryland and is a publisher, editor of St. Lucie Books. Week 6, the 10th of May, we have Music by Art by Habit. And that's an interdisciplinary group comprised of 3 artists whose medium is digital artwork. Yaoyue Huang, Emily Jiang, and Scott Sherman work together to merge contemporary piano music with digital art and performance installation. Their process is very intensely collaborative, working with music photographs and reimagining them into a final film, which is a commentary on both the music and images themselves. And then finally, week 8, or last week for this year, there'll be a panel discussion with Evergreen Professor Vuslat Katsanis and the artists that are in a group show that she is co-curating. Katsanis is a scholar of comparative literature, film, and visual culture, and is also the co-founder of Min Eastery of Post-Collapse Art and Culture, an independently run curatorial project and research space in Zurich, Switzerland. So this panel will be both Katsanis and then the co-founder of that Post-Collapse of Art Culture, Ilknur Dem-Ikoparan, and in conversation with a Suriname-based filmmaker, Keone Wright, and the American painter, Charles Edward Williams, who was with us in Winter Quarter for one of our art lectures. And there's exhibition that they are in and curating is called Play. It's a multimedia contemporary art exhibition opening in June in Zurich of this year. So they'll discuss their practices and thinking about their collective outlook toward the future through a shared interest in world making and joy. So that's what we have for this quarter. Now I just want to introduce Tom Comitta. They're an author of most recently the Nature book, out from Coffee House Press. They've also released several other books, including Airport Novella, First Thought, Worst Thought, Collected Books, 2011 to 2014. A print and digital archive of 40 night novels, art books, and poetry collections. In 2015, Royal Nonesuch Gallery installed these books in a multimedia exhibition containing drawings, video, vinyl, window installations, and a sound poetry computer program. And Comitta's fiction and essays have appeared in Wired, Lit Hub, Electric Literature, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Kenyon Review, Bomb, Joyland, the Brooklyn Rail, and Back's Best American Experimental Writing 2020, and they live in Brooklyn. I just want to say quickly, if you can follow all of those accolades, there is an interdisciplinary nature to this work. And if you go to Tom's website, you'll see that they work in poetry, fiction, sound, media, installation, collaboration, performance. So I sort of thinking of this work is often taken from other works. So as a type of intervention that's at play with these forms, right? That the different venues and work, including what you call citation fiction, which is to pull these collecting quoted materials from many sources over many times, taking them out of those contexts, combining them to reveal and construct patterns that you're seeing that open them up into other historical moments and sort of collapse and combine and stretch to a new inquiry that's relevant to our time. I think that's really interesting. And the most recent book, the Nature book, in your preface, you say, the novel contains no words of my own. In fact, through the process of collage and constraint, I have gathered nature descriptions from over 300 novels and arranged them into a single book. So thank you for being here, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shaw, for having me, and Raul and the rest of the tech department for helping, and Evergreen. Yeah, so the book Shaw was just referring to is this book, the Nature book that just came out. And I'll get to that in a minute. Basically, I'm going to present a little bit about me, like some context about my work, talk about the Nature book, and then also share some research that I did while working on the Nature book around what I call citational fiction and literary supercuts. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and actually have to do getting ahead of myself on here. Okay, here we go. All right, share the desktop, and we're going to go full screen. All right. Please let me know if you cannot see an image of pieces of paper with a bunch of dots all over them. So probably the first thing I should say is that when I started out as a writer, when I really committed myself to being a writer about 15 years ago, I, for some reason, had this feeling that to become a writer, I should learn my material in the same way that a traditional painter would learn how to paint. And I gathered that they, get to know maybe how to mix pigments, stretch canvas, build the frame of the canvas. And in language, the material is sonic or aural, and it's visual. And there's also the vessels that it goes in. So like an online publication, a print publication, a performance. And so that led to me, I was a sound poet for a while, doing some guerrilla operas, which you'll see on top there, and then some more traditional or kind of traditional musicals. That was a cappella sound poetry musical at the bottom there. Maybe if there's time at the end, I could do a sound poem for you, but for the sake of time, and we're actually going to be talking about fiction mostly, I'm just kind of going to keep moving on from there. But yeah, so as a visual poet, I made things like this typography out of hair from the internet, called Balding Type, where I've done a lot of like handwritten work, some art books, as you're seeing on the top right there. And my first publication was this book, O, or the Circle Book, or really however you want to call it. And this book was made entirely out of circles and ovals in world languages. And I went through the entire Unicode, which is this typing system that all of our computers have, and just in order collected all these circles and ovals. And some of these pages get to be pretty pictorial, as you can see here. But pretty soon on, I was a poet for maybe like 5 years, and then I just became obsessed with novels. And my first fiction project was this remix of National Novel Writing Month, which every November, thousands, if not maybe millions, of fiction writers around the world, although it says national here, I guess it began as a United States project, try to write a novel in a month. I, as a kind of like punk, kind of inversion improvement on it, chose to write novels in a night using some collage and conceptual methods. And in the process, kind of remade their website. As you see on the left is their original logo, National Novel Writing Month's logo, and then I added a knee for Night Month. I redid their website and wrote in the month of November of 2012, I think 12 novels that month. And so an example of this was this novel, The Idiot, by me, although it's a translation of Dostoevsky's The Idiot that I just set in Comic Sans. So it's kind of like a ready-made novel. And anybody who has looked at this typography or is familiar with it, people see it as kind of like the worst typography you could use. I did do one other change, which is that there's no paragraph breaks. And also where it said by Dostoevsky, it says, I choose you to by Tom Comitta with a Command F. So it'll say something like, he gazed with his fevered eyes straight into those of the general, as though he were anxious that the letter might read his thoughts by Tom Comitta, 19. The general grew purple, and so on and so forth. So this one was a very quick kind of conceptual novel. This was a night novel that I just copied and pasted search results for Waiting for God Dog. And this is like a remix of a pop song here. It's a very internet book, as you can see. There's links everywhere that you can't click on in print form. Some of them I actually wrote. Like this is a book where each page has some kind of a turn going on, a zigzag. Upon your descent, look up. One goes like, when you get to the right-hand corner, take a left. So very minimal fiction. And yeah, so in 2014, 15, around there, I realized that I had produced a lot of text from these night novels and from other projects. And Gauss PDF, this online publishing platform, published them as PDFs and print-on-demand books. And then I installed them in this show here, where, as you can see here, we did a novel writing night where maybe 10 people here, we all just got together and either made collaborative or solo novels in one night. And as you can see here on the front of that gallery, I installed an earlier version of that circle book I showed you, where it was called Point Line Shape. And so it was still going through the Unicode, but going with basically the elements of drawing, the dot, the line, and then the shape. So then after that, I just really transitioned to fiction writing. And my first published, what I call supercut, is this book, Airport Novella, which you can see here. And Airport Novella, I found that in blockbuster fiction and best-selling fiction, there are 4 gestures that were ubiquitous: nodding, shrugging, odd looks, and gasping. And so I made one chapter of nodding, one of shrugging, and so on and so forth. And it kind of becomes like a really strange dance. So for instance, did you see anything? Catherine nodded blankly. Langdon nodded, feeling a chill as he looked up. Vacher nodded, without even looking. Sato gave a grim smile and nodded to Anderson. Chief, follow me, please. I'd like a word in private. Anderson nodded and swallowed hard. Langdon hesitated and then nodded, and it keeps going. And in the gasping part here, it's just very dramatic. This is available as a free PDF online if you'd like to check it out. My second supercut was taking first sentences of New Yorker short stories published over the course of 20 years and cutting them up and searching for patterns in them and finding things like here I could tell the life story of one cis man's life from birth until divorce, but I could only tell a fragment of a cis female's story. And so it became a kind of institutional critique and actually became like Bomb Magazine's most read article that year. So there's these instances where I gathered like all the I language, as it right here, the first person language. I was able to tell in this vignette within this story, like a kind of Western narrative. And this one, a lot of short stories begin with date markers. So like here in the early 50s, this happened. In 1949, this happened. And I just chronologized these, and it kind of turned into a short story, a short story about the history of the world according to the New Yorker. So it's a little absurd. And yeah, so this book that we were referring to earlier, which just came out, but I've been working on it since 2012. And here I was when I, basically in 2012, I started early drafts on it, did about 3 versions before I got to the point where I was in this residency in Omaha, Nebraska at the Bemis Center, which I highly recommend applying to if you do work that needs a lot of space. As you can see here, it's like the biggest studio that I will probably ever have. And yeah, so I was just, I spent a year searching through text files for nature descriptions of novels particularly, and just copied and pasted them into a single document. At the end of that year, I went to this residency, printed them out, cut them up, and organized them into like macro patterns. On one table, there would be like a desert, all desert language. Another table would be like all ocean language, winter, spring, all the seasons. And in each of those tables, I would find, oh, you know, like in the desert, there's a lot of horses. In winter, there are a lot of bears and deer. And so kind of piecing together, looking at those bears, what's happening with them, you know, what other narratives are also happening in these fragments in the winter, and so on and so forth, and just throwing them up into a text that in its final form is like the 4 seasons, oceans, jungles, islands, outer space, prairies, mountains, and deserts. So that's basically the trajectory of the book. And it's just another instance. And so I would hang up, once I would string together a narrative, I would then hang it up on the wall. And you can like really see here where I'm like highlighting the parts that work in these narratives. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about in the talk part of this, we will have an opportunity to have a conversation. While I was working on the nature book, I wondered what other novels are made entirely out of found language or partially. This was mostly because I was interested in precedent, and I didn't feel like I needed like the sexiness of newness. I felt like, you know, most things have a precedent, and I just wanted to know this history. On the other hand, doing this research was very useful in that I caught wind that my publisher was concerned about copyright, and, you know, spent a few months. I'd sent them the manuscript, spent a few months doing a lot of research. And at the end of maybe 2 to 4 months, I built this bibliography of about 100 other novels that are made entirely or significantly out of found language. I sent my bibliography to the publisher, and the next day they said yes. So it's a bibliographic research that is, as you will see, I think it's a beautiful history, but also just to share, like, it's very practical research project that maybe could help you all if you ever need to use research to convince people to support your work. So what I'm about to share with you was published as an essay on LitHub. I'm going to get maybe a bit more into it than an essay. I've also put out this little like self-published book that the Creative Independent is going to release as a PDF, a free PDF soon. So, and I'd be happy to share that. So if people are interested, I can send this to Shaw, and you can get access to it in that way too, if you'd like more information. So in 1851, Herman Melville publishes Moby Dick. And at the beginning of the book are 13 pages of found whale descriptions. And they're in chronological order, as you can see here, from Genesis, and then it goes all the way up to the time of his writing, Nathaniel Hawthorne, other contemporary writers. And so it tells the story of how whales have been described throughout time. 40 years after that, Mark Twain, at the end of his book, well, at the beginning of this book, The American Claimant, he says, there's no weather in this book. Weather, nature, descriptions, they trip up the reader, they trip up the author. Authors don't usually do a very good job with them. If you want weather, flip to the back of the book, where you will find this appendix, where there are like, I think there are 7 or 8 found weather descriptions, which also includes the Bible. And they're pretty over the top pulpy. And so when I discovered these, I was, of course, amazed. Not only are there these like supercuts early on, they're all nature descriptions, which is, of course, what I was focusing on in my own book. But yeah, so what do we call this? You know, I'm calling it a supercut, but as you'll see, there's some confusion. In the poetry world, there's a vocabulary for this kind of work. The cento has been going on for almost 2,000 years, and the cento is just a poem made out of found language, usually other poems. Fu poetry in the Sung era used a lot of found language. Conceptual poetry also more recently popularized that. Although even before that, you know, people were using a lot of found language in like the 60s and you know, even much of the 20th century. But in fiction, you know, what have we called this? Sometimes we call these cut-ups. Collage novels, a term that's been used. Found language fiction. And I bring up cyberpunk and the new weird here, just to note how strange it is, as you'll see that there's this long history, but there's no real good word for it. I'm hoping to propose one, which is citational fiction. Basically, I use citational fiction to talk about works that incorporate a significant amount of found language, more than just including maybe like a song lyric, like a few lines of a song in a book, where the found language is really part of like the structure and the meaning making of the book. And yeah, so it might be entirely out of found language, or it might scatter quotation throughout. And so actually Moby Dick is a good example where he did, like, there's that supercut at the beginning, but then there are quotations scattered throughout that book that are unattributed. And we can talk about what that means to do it unattributed, which I usually think is not a good idea. That's how you can be called out for plagiarism. And I'm arguing this is not plagiarism. So then as an umbrella, so the umbrella term being citational fiction, I use the term literary supercut, and I did not coin it. We'll get to who did coin it later. For texts that are basically entirely made out of found language. The quotations in the beginning of Moby Dick, I would identify as a supercut. The only thing that Melville added was quotations and the attribution. And yeah, so a supercut can be an entire work, a novel or short story. It could be a short text thrown in the middle or beginning or end of a novel. So those examples of Melville and Twain fall under this rubric. So a brief history. If I had more time, I would get into, you know, found language prose has been going on for over 2,000 years in the form of commonplace books, and the Han Shu, this nonfiction text from China that documented the Han era, is like made entirely out of quotations, and that they're about the same age of 2,000 years in the East and the West. But in fiction, which is my subject for the day, the earliest instance I found of found language writing is with the work of Al-Jahiz of Basra and some of his contemporaries, but he was most known for it in these morality tales, which, so adab is currently in the term for literature in Arabic, but back then it was used for these kind of morality tales. And so I noted one of his most known works here. But actually, just to briefly note, you might be wondering, well, what about, the 1001 Nights or Homer? And I would call those approximate quotation, where there was never any source text to be copied. They were just kind of whispered down the lane through time. So all the texts I'm talking about are direct quotation, where somebody was able to go from one print form to another. That's, I guess, how I would distinguish when these fiction supercuts. This would be a citational fiction. It is not made entirely out of found language. The work of Al-Jahiz of Basra. And another citational work here. This text, I believe, is how many pages is it? It is 3,696 pages. It's a 5-volume text with quotations on almost every page. It includes found language from the vernacular stories, works of pornography, histories, dramas, popular songs, jokes, prosymmetric narratives, and also texts that fall outside of the literary, such as official gazettes, contracts, and menus. And this text that was written in 1850, but not discovered until 2000, in print until 2002, and discovered by Henry Louis Gates Jr., is the first novel written by an African-American woman and the only known novel to be written by a fugitive slave. And it's interesting, not only, so Crafts was basically taking language from her master's library, literally repurposing it, but also playing with the structures of these European texts that she was working with and kind of tweaking them. And I'll read you this quotation from my essay that says it much more articulately than I can say just off the top of my head. So Kraft's copying goes beyond the level of sentences and paragraphs by also adapting structural elements from white European novels about poverty and subjugation, like Bleak House and Jane Eyre, in her pseudo-autobiographical slave narrative. Scholar Catherine Kaiser notes that in her treatment of Jane Eyre, Crafts transforms Bronte's metaphorical use of slavery into a direct confrontation with the history of American race relations. This is not a quotation. Crafts literalizes Bronte's tropes of slavery and subjugation. And then, as Hollis Robin suggests in Blackening Bleak House, Crafts' use of found language has material implications as a fugitive slave, supposed property, stealing and repurposing the language, intellectual property of the masters. And the relation is also literal. As I said before, Crafts took language directly from books in her master's library. So this is a chronological telling. We've reached the 20th century, and I have this kind of ironic scare quote, the dawn of collage, because a lot of people attribute the beginning of collage work to beginning of the 20th century. With these works, particularly The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot and The Arcades Project by Walter Benjamin, which are important works, but it's just not true to say that they are the beginning of collage in the world. With regards to the early 20th century, newspapers were regularly used in citational works of fiction, but also, as you can see here, in works of art. And the biggest example in the fiction world would be John Dos Passos's USA trilogy, where these newsreel sections are cut-ups of headings from news articles, portions of news articles. We got song lyrics and This is all found language, and they're scattered throughout this 3-part trilogy, and they kind of, I mean, I kind of compare them to a supercut by The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, where they're really commenting on the news of the day in somewhat ironic and often very abstract fashion. They're basically poetry in the middle of this novel, and you can see how they work here, and you really get fragments. I don't have time to like read through them, but these are available for free on archive.org, and you can take a look more closely. All right, so in 1929, Max Ernst, the surrealist, creates this book, The Hundred Headless Woman, which is called a collage novel. And it's basically every page is similar to the one you're seeing on the right here. There are illustrations with like one sentence underneath it. And the illustrations are pretty surreal collages of illustrations from 19th century, 18th century books. And so at that time, this new word is coined, collage novel, which has been often used to describe a lot of the works that we're discussing. But the whole reason I created this new vocabulary is because I found this vocabulary to be confusing. And so basically, this is why I think it's confusing. There are three definitions. We have the Ernst version, which I talked about, where it's taking found 19th century illustrations and arranging them into surreal juxtapositions with a sentence or two of original language at the bottom. And it's an early precursor to the graphic novel. In his essay, The Ecstasy of Influence, Jonathan Lethem uses this term to talk about fragmentary or nonlinear works of fiction that blend original and found language. And maybe also are made entirely out of found language, but they use found language. And in the David Shields version, which he talks about in Reality Hunger, he uses collage novel to talk about works that have no found language, but are disjunctive and nonlinear. And so on the side here, I would put Alfred Jarry's Dr. Faustroll in the Lethem version, because there is found language, but it's also fragmentary and nonlinear. And then I would put Speedboat here by Renata Adler in the Shields version, because it's a fragmentary text. Well, he uses this term collage novel to talk about Speedboat, but it's a fragmentary text that uses no found language. So all of these works are called a collage novel, which I guess is fine, but basically I was looking for a term to describe like this kind of fiction where we're talking about found language. And so citational fiction for me became my go-to. All right, so all found at last. Basically, all found at last refers to while there were parts of novels beforehand that had strings of quotations, supercuts, in the late 50s, we started to get texts that were made entirely out of found language. And so the earliest I could find was this. It's a sketch for a novel by J.G. Ballard. But as you can see here, it's cut up from technical manuals. And it's also pretty visual. It's somewhere between visual poem and collage and supercut fiction. Also, of course, we have William Burroughs and Brian Geison's cut-ups, which first came out in this book on the right. And if you're not familiar with their method, it's pretty specific. They say, take a page, like this page, now cut down the middle and across the middle, you'll have 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now rearrange the sections, placing section 4 with section 1 and section 2 with section 3, and you have a new page. Sometimes it says much the same thing, sometimes something quite different. And so, basically what they're saying is you have a paper here and you're cutting it up into 4s like this and just moving it around. And you get strange juxtapositions, which, as you will see down here, you can see it pretty clearly in the top right here. Ahead, ahead, they chanted in New York, Honolulu, Eris, Austin. Tobacco is our middle name. no flat Los Angeles taste, and Francisco, so friendly. Okay, so those words are cut off. And yeah, so their goal was to create disjunction and try to find new meaning through chance. William Burroughs said that these works could predict the future. And yeah, so starting from that moment on, while I was saying that, we have had these citational works for a very long time, there was this like rebirth that, there were more of them than ever starting around this time in the early 60s. And one of the best known authors of this kind of writing is Kathy Acker, who's almost all of her texts have found language in them, be it in the form of like literal copy and paste, although there wasn't copy and pasting back then, it'd be retyping, or in the form of paraphrasing, and other methods. And I bring up Don Quixote, which was a dream, because in this text, at a certain point, she does something pretty unique in my experience, for like how these citational works work, which is she takes a fragment from Justine by de Sade, Marquis de Sade, and repeats a paragraph over and over again, creating this kind of, and this I'm drawing a bit from Chris Krause's autobiography and her reading of it, where she kind of compares it to like minimalist music, like Steve Reich, Terry Riley, and so on and so forth, and kind of creates this like erotic musicality. And yeah, so after Burroughs and Geisen, she's kind of seen as like the most well-known in this kind of writing in the past like 50 years. And she's a great writer of it. So yeah, and then here we have Mumbo Jumbo, which is full of newspapers and history books and found photographs and illustrations. There's a list at the end of 104 books. We have, and yeah, so as Henry Gates Lewis Jr. Says, quotations and images add texture and disjunction to the text, but also create a polyphony of perspectives that directly challenges originality. And here's an example. It's like I think this is right before the official novel begins. We have a quote from Louis Armstrong, a photograph. We have original text here on the left, and then we have this definition from the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. This is like, this Memory of Fire trilogy, or Memoria del Fuego, by Eduardo Galeano, is kind of like the most epic of the citational works. It is a novel, it's also a history book, but it's highly curated. And basically it tells the story of the Americas in the form of found stories from, well, begins with, as you'll see here, these creation stories from indigenous cultures. And then it goes up to, through when the European colonialists arrived, and then through the present of up until the time of his writing, which is the mid 80s. And as you can see here, there's this number coding where he addresses, you can go to the back and you can see exactly where he's drawing from in these fragments. And you can also see here that really the Americas is defined in the most broadest sense. We have accounts from Chile, we got Costa Rica, Washington, D.C., Havana, Cuba. And so so we're now at the 90s. We're going this chronology. And Sarah Ranch House Editions is a really exciting entry into this history. It's the first publishing house dedicated exclusively to found language fiction, citational fiction, and mostly supercuts. This book, Vast, it's a Western novel made up entirely of language from Western novels. Or this book, which is probably their most exciting book, A Rearranged Affair, the author and then publisher of Sarah Ranch House Editions, Sally Alatalo, she took, as you can see here, she took 188 romance novels broke them apart physically, took all the pages out, shuffled them around, and then made 188 new texts by collating in order these texts. So you can see on the left is a novel called Without Trust, and on the right is Madeline's Marriage. And on the left here is Reluctant Captive, and on the right there is Inward Storm. And so each of these books is a unique text. What people found while reading it is that while they're highly fragmentary and the names change, because the romance novels are so highly structured as a genre, or like there's a tradition to the and repetitive structure to them, there's kind of a consistent narrative through each of them. So this is definitely like the closest we've gotten yet to like an art book, but it's also fiction. Yeah, and so the supercuts have really risen up. This is a silly AI produced image of the rise of supercuts. And I guess I use this because, you know, you might think that like what happened in the past 20 odd years that that might have been a reason why a lot more people started making text entirely out of found language. You know, we talked about there was this conceptual writing movement, but a lot of these writers these fiction writers might have not been aware of that, or were just living during this time. And it's very likely that things like the internet and just this access to these massive archives were also affecting fiction writers too. And here we have the first instance that looks like a ransom letter. We have Woman's World by Graham Rowell, which is the story of it's a story of a woman. There's actually a twist to it that I do not want to reveal. But basically, the author wrote out a novel about the story about this woman, in that he wrote out this text and then went through women's magazines from the 1950s and found that language or language close to it. And in the process, of course, the text changed a bit based on whatever language is available, and then literally cut and pasted together a novel that looks like a ransom note. Yeah, look it up. The main conceit is a spoiler, so it's an interesting read too. And here we have the first instance that I found of somebody using the term literary supercut. It is called All 87 Times Someone Says Christian Grey in 50 Shades of Grey by Kyle Buchanan. And it was published on Vulture, I believe. And so just to give you an example of how it reads, and in it wasn't in the title here, but in the description, it calls it a literary supercut. Holy shit, Christian Grey, he's here. How? I have a few choice words for my so-called friend, none of which I can repeat in front of Christian Grey CEO. The last thing I hear before I pass out in Christian Grey's arms is his harsh epithet. Oh shit, I'm in Christian Grey's suite. Christian Grey's sweat, the notion does odd things to me. I want Christian Grey, I want him badly. The Christian Grey Inquisition is almost as irritating as the Catherine Kavanaugh Inquisition. I like to solve the riddle that is Christian Grey sooner rather than later. And so I presume, and actually for another project, I have looked at this book. The idea was that for some reason he was never Christian or Mr. Grey. He was always Christian Grey, even in informal settings. And so when you start to see patterns, people will start to maybe make supercuts out of them. And this text, published by Gauss PDF, which published my collected books piece, it's a novel made out of, as you can see here, example sentences from a dictionary that was used for obligatory English lessons in the Philippines. And so and there's no editing apart from just keeping it in chronological order. So it's very, it changes directions very quickly. But there are sometimes some interesting juxtapositions that bring out some of the colonial education that is attached to these texts. You know, you're in the Philippines, you're being obligated to learn English. You're being forced to learn English. And so like one juxtaposition here on the bottom left is The criminal is said to be living under an alias in South America, Superman, alias Clark Kent. And so that was the entry for alias that then becomes this like mini micro narrative. The most famous supercut, at least in the past 10 years, was this book, Lincoln in the Bardo. The book is largely original language, but there are these moments where George Saunders has collaged together conflicting descriptions, in this instance, of the moon, although I'll say this is where I was tricked. I thought this one was found language. And then he told me, I wrote to him, I sent him my essay. And he said, actually, I made them all up. They're faux citational. There is a part in this book, though. The bummer is that it's like the best example of what a supercut, how a supercut works, because it's like the night that Lincoln's child died, the moon is described in like 20 different ways. And it just shows, in this instance, it would be a supercut showing, you know, the fragility of memory and also the over-the-top ways people describe nature. The supercut that does exist in this book is conflicting descriptions of what Abraham Lincoln looked like. And his eyes are described as anything from blue to gray to brown. His face is described in completely different ways. He's described as ugly by some people, beautiful as some people. And my reading of the supercut would be just simply that, like, basically we learn more about the writers of Lincoln than we learn about Lincoln. And so it almost feels like a Warholian, you know, juxtaposition of screen printing where it just becomes its own new thing. It's this this really fragmentary portrait. And the last text I'll share of these citational works was a very recent work, this Augnine Fog from Catherine Scanlon. And in this text, Scanlon found a diary at an estate sale of an octogenarian woman from the late 60s. And Catherine just really fell in love with the language and the diction, and kind of worked it, massaged it into this very minimal novel that's like kind of the closest you can get to poetry in a fiction book. And I'll just read this, it's very short. So like these are 2 pages. Happy New Year, burr, burr, burr. Elvira, a cold. Harold, sleep. Few snowflakes in Eve. Emma didn't get home. And presumably the next day, or sometime after, I painting, clouding at noon. So that we're about at almost an hour. I could read a little bit of the nature book, or we could get into questions. Shaw, do you have a suggestion about what you're...
I'd love it if you'd read a little of your work.
Yeah.
And then we'll get into questions. I think we've got time.
Okay, great. Yeah.
5 minutes, yeah.
So, so once again, this book's made out of nature descriptions from 300 other novels. I'll read the first 2.5 pages, and then maybe afterwards I can tell you some of how the construction is going on here. Since the beginning, time was a form of sustenance, pleasant as the spring, comfortable as the summer, fruitful as autumn, dreadful as winter. Weeks, months, seasons passed with dreamlike slowness, and the earth moved in its diurnal course. To a waiting horse, perhaps time passed with torturous languor. To a tree, this phenomenon was common enough. Much more unusual was the fact that years passed, and by some accident, another tree arrived, and flowers, and birds, and insects. On Earth, time was marked by the sun and moon, by rotations that distinguished day from night. The present was a speck that kept blinking, brightening, and diminishing, something neither alive nor dead. How long did it last? 1 second? Less? It was always in flux. In the time it took to consider it, it slipped away. There were times, though, especially towards the end of a long, cold, dark winter, when time slowed to an operatic present, a pure present. Sun was all shrouded over with mist and could no longer shine brightly. The snow began to fall straight and steadily from a sky without wind, in a soft universal diffusion, a continuous symphony. At such a moment, it seemed that time stopped. The day and the scene harmonized in a chord. Words. Was it the shifting colors? The snow fell so thick that it was only by peering closely that such heavy flakes blended like the elements of color, elements that, somewhere in the grid of time, would recede and show that, amid the prostration of the larger animal species, the few nearby trees and plants buried under amorphous white cloaks and white storms, time disappeared, and it was like seeing all time, as you might see a stretch of mountains. All time, the slow passage of years, the constant alterations. It was all ephemeral, filmy, dreamy. It was the mystery of creation, the stupendous miracle of recreation, the vast rhythm of the seasons, measured, alternative. The sun and the stars keeping time as the eternal symphony of reproduction swung in its tremendous cadences like the colossal pendulum of an almighty machine. Primordial energy flung out from the hand of the Lord God himself, immortal, calm, infinitely strong. The earth was at work as it is always at work, and it moves slowly. 1,000 times in the future, this irresistible movement would change the aspect of the earth's surface. Mountains continued to push upward. New forming land would rise from the sea to be weathered by storm and wind. Sometimes the sea would wash in bits of animal calcium, or a thundering storm would rip away a cliff face and throw its remnants over the shore. At other intervals, flowers would bloom, spectral substance vibrating in silent winds of accelerated time. Time lapse of 1,000,000 billion flowers opening their heads, of 1,000,000 billion flowers bowing, closing their heads again, of 1,000,000 billion new flowers opening instead, of 1,000,000 billion buds becoming leaves, and then the leaves falling off and rotting into earth, of 1,000,000 billion twigs splitting into 1,000,000 billion brand new buds. The grass would be growing and dying back to nothingness in much the same fashion. Wherever sun sunned and rain rained and snow snowed, wherever life sprouted and decayed, places were alike. Winter was long. Spring was a very flame of green. On certain spring days, there was a hint of summer in the air. In the shadows, it was cool. But the sun was warm, which meant good times coming. When the days were longer, when summer afternoons were spacious, laughter was on the earth. Primroses were broad and full of pale abandon. The lush dark green of hyacinths was a sea, with buds rising like pale corn. The rich odor of roses and the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees. Flowers, acre after acre, bloomed side by side. Each bathed in the sun, each held the wind's sway, each deeply rooted in the rich dark soil. Poppies, sunflowers, daffodils, dogwoods, tiger flowers waved in the sun, and the days were bright with the colored balls of song as the birds tossed back and forth. Small, unspeckled birds. These were the realities of the external world. And then summer begins. And so, yeah, one thing I can say about what you just heard is that is basically, it begins with like a supercut of time, authors thinking about time, also like the creation and destruction of the earth. And it was, as I was trying to figure out how to write the beginning of this book, I studied nature documentaries. which often begin, if you've seen them, with like a wide shot of Earth. It's like our place among the stars, our home among the stars. And then it zooms into maybe, a snowy landscape or a desert. And then we get closer and we might see like a bear or a goat. And so this tried to do something like that. It's kind of really wide shot, thinking very broadly about time. And then getting closer and closer, we get this like winter scene, and then shots of the creation and destruction of the earth. And then literally right after what I read to you, the story kind of begins with this summer, and then proceeds through the 4 seasons. So yeah, we're about at an hour. I could also do a sound poem that I was describing. We could also just
Sure, give us some samples of your work, and then and then we'll jump in with
okay.
questions.
Yeah. So sound poem, I was mentioning, sound poem is basically a text that only makes sense when written, when performed aloud. And so for this piece, actually, it's like the first piece that I wrote that uses a very similar method to this, where I found an archive on the internet of tongue twisters, English language tongue twisters. And I cut them up. At the time, I did not have a big studio space. I had a living room floor. I put them out on the living room floor and found, okay, here's first person language, here's second person he, she language. Here's a lot of questions. Here's like B sounds, bubbling, bubber, butter, bums, or whatever, buttons. And so this first piece I'll do for you right now, it's all the questions that I found. And it's a little absurd, as you'll see. And the one way I often introduce it too is that the text sound artist Richard Castellanets talks about tongue twisters as the folk dimension of sound poetry. I guess folk in that it's just kind of passed down. Attribution is not really often attributed to one person. And so I sometimes think about this as like a kind of folk music. So it's called Warm Up. How much wood woodchuck woodchuck wood? 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 Woodchuck wood? How much woodchuck woods or chuck woods woodchuck wood? If chuck woods woodchuck wood, how much wood could in wood chuck woods woodchuck? How much ground ground? How much chef do? How much black sparkles pot? How many cookies? How many yaks? Yak pack yaks? How many cans? Cannibal cans? Can a can how can a clam cream can? How can a clam cream how much myrtle? What's a little myrtle? How much myrtle? What's a little myrtle? How much dough would bottle dough? How much dough would bottle dough? So that is a sound poem. And yeah, I sometimes see the nature book as like an incredibly soft sound poem. Where, yeah, if that is the loud, flamboyant, over the top side, the thing you heard before would be the furthest I could get to like ambient sound poetry.
I wish we could have applauded your poem.
Thanks.
That was really impressive.
Oh, thanks. And I did not practice it beforehand.
That's amazing. I mean, the tongue twister is hard enough. That was really.
Well, I just say that because it's like, it's the thing that you use to practice, Yeah.
What do you mean?
Like actors will use tongue twisters to get ready.
Ah, right, yeah. right.
Or singers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was impressive.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So talk was pretty heavily on the history side, but hopefully people who are, hope would be that, usually if I had published this book as an art book, half of all of us here would be like, oh yeah, we know like 15 other things that are like this. But I mean, I sincerely thought about it as a novel, and I do think it's interesting to map this history in this particular tradition.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I will applaud for all of us. Thank you so much for that history. It was really rich, fast, lots of stuff to take off on our own research projects and our own work. So really huge wealth of information. I really appreciate it. I'm going to lead off, and I want you all to please join us in questions and conversation and comments. And the two ways to do it: either raise your hand and then you'll be prompted to unmute. And we'd prefer to actually hear from you if you can muster the courage, or you can type something in the Q&A and we'll go between those two things. But please jump in and talk with us. I also know, this archive fever that Hal Foster wrote about probably 10 years ago. It's been kind of fascinating that it is just, everywhere. All kinds of sampling and appropriation has been going on for at least, for a long time, as you show, but for the last 50 years, it's definitely been increasing constantly. And then the Lincoln and the Bardo was kind of an amazing, wonderful, just mainstream, straight up kind of novel that disseminated that, I feel, and sort of in the mainstream. Yeah. But I'm curious about what we think is going on sort of emotionally in mining this, like in the nature book, thinking about the accounts of things that no longer are, like this kind of trying to summon, first person, narratives of or descriptions of things that are no longer with us. So what has been, I mean, it's, even if it was written yesterday, it's what has the news. So what do you think about the longing part of it, or the haunting part of it, or I'm just curious about that part.
Yeah, I mean, so the book looks at about 300 years of writing, because the English language novel goes back about that far. And one of the interesting, was not like the impetus, but you start a project and you like learn things while you're going. That 300-year history tracks almost directly with the rise of capitalism, as we know today, with industrialization, and with the Anthropocene. And so, and of course it makes sense, if you look into histories of the novel, we needed industrialization to create a print culture that could, allow the novel to thrive. And then, of course, industrialization led to fossil fuels being burnt and so on and so forth. So there's that like material aspect. And yeah, I mean, I note this in the introduction that, we're the natural world of like Dickens and Austen and like Baldwin and Atwood. And then like as recent as like, Zadie Smith and Jonathan Lethem here, there are species that don't exist anymore. And really the book is a kind of time capsule. I think I cut the source text off at about 2015. And because of that, there is only one direct description of climate change in the book. As we're entering back into the atmosphere after being in outer space, there's a description of polar ice caps melting. And this is because I cut it off at about 2015. People started to write about climate change much more around then. And yeah, but then there's other things, like, my biggest observation in writing the book, if I were to like write, if I've like got an unofficial PhD in eco-linguistics or something, my PhD would basically say that more often than not in Western tradition of novel writing, when we write about nature, we're often writing about people. And you know, there's this perspective throughout. There's this really moody voice that is either raging when it's storming or melancholic when it's raining. And then when the sun comes out, it's joyous, ecstatic, unless you're in the desert when it's a villain. And also like but I also kept in a lot of these like metaphorical relations to people. You know, the elbow of the sun going over the horizon, or like the kingdom of bugs, as a way to describe the bugs. And I did that because it's just how it maps how we write. And so the reason I bring this up, it maps how we think about nature and writing. And the reason I bring this up is that one thing also that kind of looking back is that throughout the book, there's this refrain of referring to nature as a framed and flattened object, and which is often connected to the technology of the day. So, you know, before the invention of photography, writers would often be like, it was as pretty as a picture. Once photography comes out, it was as beautiful as a picture or a postcard. And then, you know, eventually it's like as beautiful as a film, like it looked like an LED screen, you know, like, so we have these things. But yeah, so the book does map these out. And yeah, there is this melancholy to it. It's all in past tense, except for the footnotes, which are mostly in present. This is where I put all the present tense language originally, and then it kind of grew into this other thing. And yeah, the book is like, some readers has made them cry. I've been told, and I wonder if part of that has to do with maybe climate grief. I don't think that that's the end of the effect of the book. I hope not. I also think that it's just kind of an overwhelming, maybe reading experience. There's this onslaught of nature. One person said she cried when we got into outer space and looked back at the planet. The other person said it was the end. The end is a lot about like birth and death, so maybe it was just sad. Maybe it wasn't about climate grief, but yeah. So I you know.
We have a question.
Oh, great.
Q&A, if you can read it. Can you see it? This is by
Let's
Trey.
see. Yeah, let's see. Okay. I can read out loud.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Trey. This is from Trey. This is beautiful to hear. Thank you. Could you repeat the title and author of the collection around forced English learning with the criminal and Clark Kent connection? So that was Angelo V. Suarez, Philippine English. And you can see that today as a free PDF on Gauss PDF, GAUSS PDF. Yeah. And then the other question is, and how do you find places to get your work published? I fear having odd work and not finding the places that want it. So yeah, this was really wonderful. Thank you for your time sharing your art. Yeah, so yeah, I, like many people, get a lot of rejection, and have for this kind of work. You know, how do I find them? I mean, I will submit these texts to the most normie of normie places and also experimental places, with the goal being maybe just kind of trying to bring this work and these kind of conversations into a larger public, or to even kind of like intervene in these spaces where these conversations maybe aren't happening. And I've been surprised at how receptive journals and this publisher, Coffee House, and my editor, Lizzie Davis, like really championed this book. She really fought for it. I think she just needed this bibliography to get her over the edge. But I guess I'm of the opinion that there's an editor, or I guess in the case of a curator for everything. It's just a matter of finding the right person. And maybe sometimes it's you for a bit. You know, I've self-published things, and before this book, everything I had put out, except for one book, that circle book, was like kind of friend, colleagues, like we're friends, like who were just putting out these small press publications. And then oddly, yeah, I thought it was going to be a real uphill battle to publish these found language fiction, citational fiction supercuts. But people were pretty receptive. And I've actually found, I think that my finding is that audiences really are interested in it. As I said, that Bomb Magazine piece became the most read piece on Bomb Magazine that year, the New Yorker piece. And then this novel, you know, I did spend a very long, Coffee House Press is a publicity team, and but I spent about 6 months writing emails trying to get this book out there. And, you know, it was reviewed in the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, all these places. So I feel like people in this era of just endless Marvel universe media and things, people just are hungry for something different, I think. I mean, this was not a bestseller, but it did sell out the first print run in the first month. So, so yeah, so to find places, you know, I would start out kind of working with your friends, get a few publications under your belt, and but also you can simultaneously send things out to bigger places. You know, you never know. But it is sometimes it's a little hard to get started in these bigger places. But like, for instance, I mean, yeah, it's who you know, like the Bomb thing. I had submitted so many things to Bomb Magazine, and they found my piece in a slush pile, which is just like the open submission pile. But it was a person who knew me who found it and took it out and sent it to the right editor. So it does help to be social. I don't know. I can get more into that, but we also have a few more questions I want to give space to. This is from Saz, if I have that correctly. Would blackout poetry be considered a cento, or is there another word for that? Also, do you have any thoughts on predictive text fiction / poetry and or AI fiction / poetry? I've been messing around with AI to get inspired and ideas going for songwriting lately, but I don't know how useful it'll prove to be yet. Cool. Blackout poetry. Yeah, you could call it a cento. You could call it conceptual poetry. I think some people just call it blackout poetry too. Yeah, I don't think that anybody would tell you that it has to be one of those things, but I think all those terms would work. And yeah, I've also used AI a little bit. Before ChatGPT came out, I had access to the GPT-3 playground, and I wrote part of a novel with it. And I don't know if I can talk as much to like concerns about robots taking over the world, but and thinking about fiction, I am not as worried about it. I think that it's an interesting tool. And I think my feeling based on my work with it is that at this point, and it might change, it's so dependent on a human hand that only a good artist would make anything good out of it. You know, there's so much editing and curating and deciding which fragment to use and which to not use. So there's that. And I also feel like it's an interesting challenge. You know, I have some friends who are like illustrators who are worried with the DALL-E and Midjourney coming out. But particularly thinking about writing again, you know, I feel like it's an interesting challenge. Like in this era where it seems that style and like genre can be so easily replicated, you know, maybe the challenge is what can we write that the AI can't? And I found that it can't do this. I asked it to do this. I asked it to write me a novel made out entirely of found language. It wrote me a short story out of found language. And then I said, okay, what are the sources? And it said like Faulkner, Austin. But then when I copied and pasted the text into Google, it was not found. It had just written it and then lied saying that it was found language. So at the moment, it can't write this. And it might never. Probably it would be like, it's plagiarism. I can't do it. So yeah, I don't know. The carbon footprint of those programs is really bad. That is objectively a problem. And that needs to be worked on. I also think as a tool, it's just a tool, and I get some of the fears around like papers and things, but there's just a few thoughts at the moment. All right, so Zachary says, beautiful prose in the nature book. Thank you. Thank you. I noticed some interesting phrases in the first section you read, including all time, creation, recreation. It's almost as if the text is commenting on itself to some degree. I agree. During your lecture, I thought about repurposing art or words as allowing that particular symbol or passage to basically transcend time in a sense. The work you do seems to really comment on meaning or trying to shift or note a shift of the previously intended meaning. Is there anything related to interpretation and meaning that we may find useful as readers when approaching a work of citational fiction? Going to your first part about the text is commenting on itself to some degree, I'm really delighted that you said that. Everybody keeps saying that the book is biblical, and there was like God in there, and their God comes back. But I wonder if it's also because of the first line, which is, since the beginning, time was a form of sustenance, and so on. And to me, that was kind of inspired. Sorry, there's a dog. That was kind of inspired by the beginning of Wittgenstein's Mistress by Marxson, where it says, in the beginning, I left messages on the street. But also, I read that as, so the line is, since the beginning, time was a form of sustenance. I sometimes read it as, since the beginning of this book, time is a form of sustenance. And then, I kind of just introduced things like the present was a moment that, the present was a speck that kept blinking, brightening, and diminishing. So I feel like I'm drawing attention to the fact that like, this text is a book, but also it's like, really, it is like the moment that you're experiencing it. So I feel that very much with what you said. Is there anything related to interpretation and meaning that we may find useful as readers when approaching a work of citational fiction? I mean, it is pretty broad, but that's okay. Let me just see what you said about the interesting time and sense. Yeah, I mean, I feel like these works are interesting because they're working with you're taking the materials of history or the present, which then of course is, you're noting Shaw, like immediately becomes history, and you're able to recontextualize them and kind of create like a critique pretty immediately. I think that they're really effective as ways of like intervening directly into the material of an ideology, a discourse, a tradition. And so that seems to be meaning to me. I think that the Hannah Crafts text is the best example of that. She's taking the work of her master's library and like stealing it, like, and that's like a political, like, important act. And yeah, I'd be happy if you want to do a follow-up to that. If I did not answer your question, I'd be happy to do that. But I hope that that's kind of going somewhere close to it. All right.
Actually, their hand is up, so maybe Zachary, would you talk to us?
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
clarify.
Yeah, hello, Tom and Shaw. Thank you for allowing me to come up and just, I wanted to say what you said, when you said the word critique, it really perfectly answered my question as far as what I was thinking. So with my intention behind what I wrote, yeah, coming to the text, maybe looking at it as a form of critique is definitely helpful for me, trying to just frame where it's where it's coming from as I think, maybe a movement or something within writing. But yeah, thank you very much for the reply and for the lecture. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you. All right, Floor says, how did you find your personal voice when it came to writing? The thing that set you apart from others? I find it hard sometimes to personalize my stories or my poetry to me. Yeah, so when I was starting out as a poet, I was writing poems through most of my life. When I was like, I'm going to be a poet, it was like 2008. And I was in San Francisco about to go to MFA school. And I had just discovered the work of Martin Kippenberger, who is this German painter who made intentionally bad paintings. And I was really drawn to them. There was something about the badness or just the style that felt very honest to me. And I just remember sitting in a park one day being like, I'm Tom Comitta. I'm not Walt Whitman or Emily Dickinson. At the time I was being a poet, like, it just feels very overwhelming to write and to claim that title of poem. At the time I was, 22 or 3 and unpublished, all these things. And there was something in that idea of writing bad that was incredibly empowering to me. And because in that, so I would sit down and I would try to write a poem and intentionally be bad. And I mean like the worst I could be. Not offensive, but like that exercise, if you sit down and try to write bad, I feel like your body just like relaxes. This, particularly in a first draft, it's like, I think a very healthy thing to just allow yourself to be a little bad. But if you sit down and you just try to intentionally, like, I'm going to write the worst thing I can right now, you kind of learn a little bit about yourself, because you're up against what you've been taught is good. And we've learned this from other books we've read, teachers, friends, but it really makes you figure out, like, what do you feel? What does that mean to you? And maybe it just kind of tricks you into loosening up. So that is how I've really kind of loosened up a bit. I am also kind of a perfectionist. This book like drove me totally bonkers. But like, it's also in this tradition of the bad. Like, this was the worst idea I could do. It's a novel. It's made of everything that nobody wants to read in novels. And yet I did try to make it readable. There are cliffhangers. And people seem to be reading it. But I don't know. I think that I don't know if that works for everybody, but I gave like a few workshops of bad writing, and I think people have liked it. So that's one way. But I don't know, I'm just trying to learn to like believe in myself over the years. And like, I'm so obsessively doing this. It's just, I feel like this is like one thing I can contribute to. I don't all right, let me Trey has a question. Not a question, just happy. Oh, thank you so much. This was really inspiring and helpful. The nature book sounds like it would make me cry, but in the like awe-filled sort of way. It's really wonderful being able to listen. This will help me open up my own creativity and find more places to be inspired by. Thank you. I hope send me an email with what you have. I have a contact form on my website. I'd be curious to see what comes out of that. Lenora says, long, I can read it out and you can read it, or you can read it out from here if we're short on time. I'll read it out. So this talk couldn't have been timelier in so many ways, and just an amazing tour, and your work is fantastic. Thank you. For our program, Writing Visual Culture, we read Saussure's Course in General Linguistics and Freud's Creative Writers and Daydreaming this week, which was a partially accidental super setup for this, to think about citational fiction and the literary supercut, since Saussure is so much about language as fixed meaning and Freud about what emerges as a result of, but to the side of that fixity, symptoms, symbols, jokes, dreams, and art. Can I ask what theoretical work, if any, feels important to your work, or your approach to the work of others? I feel like probably the theorist that was most significant to me when I was like developing this kind of stuff was Jacques Rancière, and his ideas of like the emancipated spectator, which to me I just think of as renegotiating the relationship between like an author and a reader, a presenter and an audience, and finding ways to kind of empower the reader. And I think in some ways that's pretty like here, obviously this is curated, but I sometimes feel like in some ways I'm just as much a reader of it as anybody else, because there were so many constraints. There were things I wanted to do, but I couldn't based on the constraints. And so, yes, this is my curation, but I was able to trick myself enough to maybe challenge my subjectivity. And I feel like I got that from the writings of Jacques Rancière. Who else? I mean, I've read like a lot of these texts. I mean, the class where I learned about Rancière at grad school was it was called Aesthetics After the Postmodern Turn, and we read a lot about beauty. And I don't know if the teacher Joseph Tanke is still into this, but he was like, the next movement in art and theory is going to be about beauty. And this was in 2010, and that has not panned out. But I think he made me realize the importance of like allowing that in. This might be seen as like an avant-garde work. That's not for me to say. I mean, as I said, like this form has been used for like a very long time, so I don't need that category. But a lot of these like experimental works, I feel like push against that, and I think I felt comfortable inviting that into these kind of spaces and conversations, whatever the beauty can do. I mean, so those are some first thoughts. But yeah, I've read a lot about eco theory, criticism, what was the other? Anyway, I might have some other thoughts as we're going along. Oh, that wasn't Lenara, that was Kathleen. So thank you, Kathleen. All right, so Matthew says, are most found fiction and or poetry works made utilizing one or more than one published work? And if more than one, are they mostly connected or closely related to each other in terms of content that is presented? Also, what is the difference between found fiction and citational fiction? I would say they're the same thing. Sometimes I think maybe I should have just called it found fiction, but that's the term that I used earlier. I think that they're interchangeable, and I feel like they both have less problems than the collage novels. So I sometimes use that probably in this talk, found fiction. So I think people mostly use multiple sources, partially probably for copyright reasons. If you do this kind of work, I would look into fair use, like fair use guidelines, so that you stay safe. Although, fortunately, knock on wood, it seems that, well, some of us are artists here, so I do your research, please. Into fair use. I found that images have legal issues more than text. So fair use will help you there. But I bring that up because part of fair use is using a smaller portion of a text. And so that might be one reason, unfortunately, why people would use multiple texts. But there are works that have used like one text. Like there was this writer in the UK who retyped On the Road by Jack Kerouac and called it On the Road. He could have just copied and pasted it. So who knows? But it was the idea was to retype it. So that's one work. And with regards to us all as creators, whether people have only used one work or multiple works, I think it's really like whatever idea you're working on will kind of guide that. Some works need to just be about one text, interrogating. Maybe you're like, this text is a problem, I'm going to do a blackout erasure of it, as we were discussing, or Hugo Manriquez, he took like the NAFTA NAFTA and like did a blackout piece of that. So that's like a way to, and like finding like pulling out different narratives, having it say things it wasn't supposed to say. So it's both. It could be, people use both like multiple works and not. And then the question, are they mostly connected or closely related to each other in terms of content that is presented? I feel like people often, because these are, we were talking about the term archive, you know, I think that these people often are kind of, at least in the past 20 years, trying kind of gathering similarities. You know, the Burroughsian version, well, it led to disjunction, but like early on, those supercuts were like all like Time Magazine and newspapers. So that would be a pretty curated data set or whatever you want to call that, that he was working with. But some people are just a lot more associative. There's a, if you read my essay, I think this is in LitHub, but it is in this that will be available for free and I can send to Shaw. There's this anecdote about Flann O'Brien writing At Swim Two Birds, the novel. And I'll just read this to you. He's just throwing in whatever into this book. This is a quote from his friend, Flann O'Brien's friend. As the book progressed, Brian gleefully borrowed any material that came to hand. One day I showed him a sales letter from a news market tipster, and it turned up in total in the next wad of typescript that he produced. About the same time, I had done some translations from Catullus, and he asked me for a copy. Later, it came out in his book. That is unethical, I think, but he still did it. I think that it would be not nice for you to take your friend's translation and publish it in your own book without asking them. But yeah, are we done?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, like, unfortunately, you're not coming right back next week because that is a huge area, I think, of intrigue and interest around when we do citations and how we're crediting and how we are using them. Yeah, so I think that as a critique of sorts, or even taking them up, you know, appropriating. So thank you so much. That was really rich for all of us. Like, really,
thank you.
so we're so grateful.
Yeah.
And
Thank you
we
for having
will,
me.
yeah, thank you.